If I wrote that, you would say that's a parallel period. If I wrote that, you'd say that's a parallel period with a repeated consequent phrase. If I wrote this out, that would be an example of a phrase group, and so forth. Okay, we'll work on this some more in a minute. Okay, 3 phrases equals a phrase group. 4 phrases equals a double period. All right. With phrase groups, we didn't use the term parallel and contrasting. We only use terms parallel and contrasting when we're talking about periods and double periods. And the way to determine those is the same criteria in terms of comparing the first measure of the first phrase in a double period, but you compare it with the beginning of the first phrase of the third phrase in a double period. So you determine if it's parallel or contrasting by comparing first measure of phrase 1 with first measure of phrase 3. And then use parallel or contrasting. So, if you have this situation, this means that you have at least one note that's different than this, but the first measure of this is parallel to the first measure of this third phrase. Then you'd say that that is a parallel double period. On the other hand, if you had something like this, then this would be an example of a contrasting because the beginning of the first and third phrase are not parallel. All right, so you have, even more possibilities. Then you could have something like this. So you have 4 phrases. They are all parallel in construction. You would call this a parallel double period. I'm just going to write P, D, P. Parallel double period. Well, let's do this, okay. So this is exactly the same as this. However, you have this second phrase that's contrasting, and therefore this would not be an exact repetition. It has to be consecutive units, either a phrase that is exactly repeated back to back, or a period that every note is exactly the same, but it is consecutive in the way that it's presented back to back. All right, so this would be an example of a parallel double period. And then let's do some more. So if we had this is an example of an exact repetition. So that is in a consecutive fashion. Therefore, you would say this is a phrase group that has a repeated first phrase. All right, so if we had more than 4 phrases, that equals a period group. Something like that would be an example. So it's not as common, but that's the term for more than 4 phrases, is a period group. All right? There are 2 more terms that I want to present here. The first is the term modified parallel period. And so if you will turn to page 43, then this is a situation in which it looks like you have a contrasting period, okay? So it wouldn't really apply if you have, a parallel period where the beginnings of, the antecedent and the consequent were parallel. But if it looks like that, if the beginning of each of those are contrasting, you want to go and look for one more thing, which would be the end of the antecedent phrase, whether it is parallel to the beginning of the consequent phrase. So let's do it this way. I'll say, so we have 2 phrases that appear to be contrasting. Check the end of the antecedent phrase to see if it is parallel to the beginning of the consequent phrase. If so, if the answer is yes, then it's called a modified parallel period. Okay, so that is one situation when you have what looks like it's a contrasting period. So 2 phrases that are beginning of each is contrasting. Then check to see if the end of the antecedent is parallel to the beginning of the consequent. And then if that's the case, then you call it modified parallel period. All right, so there's some examples you can look at in the book for that. So that's one exceptional type. The other exceptional type is what is called a 3-part period. And so in the textbook, this is on page 44. And this is a situation which is the shortest ternary pattern. And it's a situation where the first phrase, it looks like it's a phrase group, okay? But the first phrase and the third phrase are the same. So, okay, so three-part period. So three-part period, you write out three-part period. Or you can have this situation too. Those are two basic situations like that. And so there is an example, there's a Schumann example there, which is the A prime, A, and that is three-part period. Okay, so we use those terms, modified parallel period for that specific situation, where the end of the antecedent is parallel to the beginning of the consequent, and they are not parallel at the beginning phrases. And then three-part period to describe this situation. Now, you know, if this is like super close to this, sometimes you could use that term, three-part period, even though this is not exactly every note. Maybe just the last note is somehow not the same length, maybe, or anyway, we'll see. And there might be a little bit of discretion on that, but these are the general definitions of this terminology. So let's go through a few more of these examples here that I'll give you. So I'll give you something like this. If I said describe the phrase construction, and I just gave you the letter A, you would say that is a phrase. And if I gave you A, you'd say that's a repeated phrase. Or I could give it this way. That would be the same. If I gave you AB, you would say that is a contrasting period. If I gave you would say that's a repeated contrasting period. Or if it was written out, every note is exactly the same, that's the same as this. Those are equal. So that's a phrase, that's a parallel period, that's a phrase group, that's a contrasting double period, that's a period group. That would be a repeated parallel period. That would be a parallel double period. That would be a three-part period. That would be a contrasting double period. that also would be a contrasting double period. And so forth. All right, so I will give you some theoretical examples like that on this quiz, and I'll ask you to describe the phrase construction. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is to look at some examples from a sight singing text. So if you will go to the website, and if you will go to where it says homework on that home page, and if you will open up that first homework assignment, which you probably still haven't opened up from earlier in the lecture, then we are going to look at these sight singing examples. So these start on the second page of that with a number 16, which is a Haydn quartet, opus 3, number 3. And you can clearly see this is 2 4-measure phrases. And you see it's not an exact repetition of itself, so this is going to be some type of period. And so you compare the beginning of the antecedent with the beginning of the consequent. And although it has then an extra note at the end of the consequent phrase, Stein would call this a parallel period. And so that's what I want you to do with each one of these, is to go through and to assign letter names for the phrases. So in general, you want to look at 4 measures being the basic length of a phrase. So we'll put here, that's the default, like the default setting for a phrase length. However, you can look at 2-measure phrase lengths or 8-measure phrase lengths depending on 2 factors. But it has to be based on the tempo or the meter or a combination of both. So if you have a really fast tempo, so let's say you're in 3/8 and it's presto, well then you might be looking at 8-measure phrase length. So 8 measures would be the length of one phrase. Obviously 8 measures of 3/8 is the same as 4 measures of 6/8. So that's one example of where the tempo is really fast. Let's say that you have a meter that is in 4/4, and you have 16th note subdivision of the beat, and that you have a tempo that is adagio. Well, then you might look at 2-measure phrase length, and that would be, something where you have so many notes within those 2 measures that would equal for that particular context, that would be the length of the phrase. So these would be the 2 criteria that you would use to justify calling something in either shorter or longer. Now here's one basic rule of thumb, and that is if you are looking at a piece that is in a 4